The hook. First 30 seconds. April 13th, 1970, 55 hours and 54 minutes into the mission. A sudden violent shudder rips through the spacecraft, a sound that should have been impossible 200,000 miles from Earth. The lights flicker, and alarms scream across mission control in Houston. They hear the crack, the unmistakable sound of tearing metal, followed by a sudden, profound electrical silence. We all know the heroic tale of improvisation that brought them home. But what if the true crisis wasn't the explosion itself, but the fact that the people who built the crippled ship knew the bomb was already primed? The investigation that followed uncovered internal findings pointing to management failures and procedural shortcuts at the manned spacecraft center, findings that were never meant for the public record. Chapter 1. The Sound of Failure. The telemetry drops. DC main bus A plummets to 28.5 volts. DC main bus B follows. The voice of an astronaut, strained, cuts through the static. Houston, we've had a problem here. The world hears the emergency, the struggle for oxygen, the desperate calculations made in the cramped confines of the lunar module Aquarius. The official narrative settles quickly, a random, unforeseen mechanical catastrophe. The world watches the nail-biting recovery, believing that only extraordinary human ingenuity saved the crew. More than any other incident in the history of spaceflight, this recovery solidified the world's belief in NASA's capabilities. But behind the curtain, something far more troubling was taking shape in the sterile, windowless rooms of the Manned Spacecraft Center, the MSC. The initial inquiries were focused squarely on oxygen tank number 2, the physical culprit in the service module. Post-incident testing replicated the failure. Rig the tanks with the wrong voltage on the heaters, and the insulation melts, the wires ignite, and boom. A straightforward electrical short in a piece of aging hardware. But the deeper the internal review dug, the more the technical error began to look like a symptom of a deeper corrosion within the center's operational culture. Chapter 2. The Ghost of Apollo 1. The real story begins years earlier, echoing the tragedy of Apollo 1. That disaster, the fire that killed 3 astronauts on the launch pad, was a stark lesson in safety protocols, specifically regarding the materials and internal atmosphere of the command module. Yet, as engineers began preparing the tanks for Apollo 13, the institutional memory seemed to fade, replaced by relentless pressure to meet launch schedules. Within the MSC's review process, there was a clear, documented pattern. Required hazard analyses concerning the tank heaters and thermostats were not just skipped, they were actively categorized as unnecessary. A procedural shortcut taken because the component itself was considered mature technology. One internal memo never released to the public discussed how the design review boards, under pressure from program management, had begun treating certain safety checks as bureaucratic hurdles rather than life-saving prerequisites. The voltage used to test the tank's internal switches, the very voltage that caused the wires to short in 1970, was almost double what the standard power supply delivered, a fact known but seemingly dismissed in the final certification stages. Chapter 3. The Buried Disciplinary File. The explosion rips the bay cover clean off the service module. The physical evidence is undeniable. But the internal reckoning at MSC was not about how the wires failed. It was about who signed off on ignoring the test results. The forgotten findings pointed directly at several mid-level program managers and quality assurance supervisors. Their failure wasn't in engineering, it was in management oversight, a known risk tolerance that permeated the system. These were not scapegoats. These were individuals whose repeated memos raising red flags about test procedures had been overruled, often citing schedule slips. The internal disciplinary reviews initiated immediately after the near disaster meticulously detailed these administrative failures. They showed a management structure actively prioritizing on-time delivery over absolute component certainty. These reviews were thorough, recording specific instances of procedural compromise. Chapter 4. The Silence of PR. The Courtright Commission, the official board tasked with investigating the accident, delivered its final, heavily vetted report. It spoke eloquently of the crew's bravery and the ground team's brilliant recovery, fulfilling the need to reassure a nervous public. It cemented the image of NASA as unflappable. But the detailed disciplinary paperwork, the internal transcripts showing managers justifying the procedural shortcuts, these were sequestered. The knowledge gap widens here. The public received an account of technical failure and heroic success, not one of systemic human error leading to institutional accountability. The internal disciplinary reviews showing specific individuals were culpable for known risks were effectively buried. They were scrubbed from the public record, deemed too damaging to the agency's hard-won credibility. The electronic records showing who signed which waiver, who ignored the voltage warnings, they disappeared into classified archives, replaced by generalized statements about lessons learned. Chapter 4 Numbers de Zekasernans the Trust Speech for Professional du Lupio. Chapter 6 The Zikapidor and Mark 5 Ris Logalbachifimavatat. Shivavsturdi. The world celebrated, and in that celebration the need to address internal malfeasance dissolved. If the public knew that the near-death experience was predicated on known, ignored risks, the entire perception of NASA's competence would have shattered. The internal reviews led to quiet administrative actions, non-disclosures, and transfers personnel facing quiet consequences behind closed doors, but nothing that would ever surface in a public inquiry about the oxygen tank explosion. The final minutes of the investigation into Apollo 13 reveal a sobering truth. The same institutional arrogance that nearly cost 3 men their lives on the launch pad was still operational, simply masked by the spectacular execution of a rescue mission. The mechanical failure was an accident. The fact that the tank was a ticking time bomb was a failure of management, a failure that was consciously erased from the history books to protect the myth of American infallibility in space. Chapter 6 The Echo in Challenger. The confidence instilled by the Apollo 13 rescue was not a restorative tonic, it was an anesthetic, dulling the necessary pain of institutional reform. The internal findings detailing a culture where risk assessments were negotiable and procedural integrity was secondary to schedule demands were shelved. This manufactured confidence, this belief that NASA could solve any problem after the fact, began to seed itself into the next generation of space hardware. If the system could withstand and even benefit from a near-fatal oversight on the moon mission, why enforce stringent, costly delays for minor procedural checks on future programs? The shadow of the buried Apollo 13 review extended forward, not just as a missed opportunity for reform, but as an active blueprint for managing crises internal. When the Space Shuttle program began, the focus remained heavily on the brilliance of the design and the execution, less on the evolving stress points in the management structure. The engineers who had witnessed the internal suppression of the Apollo 13 hazard reports, those who knew the true cost of complacency, were either moved into non-critical roles or left the agency disillusioned. The vacuum was filled by a new generation taught through osmosis. Success is the ultimate absolution. This cultural inheritance manifested most catastrophically in 1986, over 16 years after the oxygen tank rupture. The failure of O-ring seals in cold weather, leading to the destruction of the Space Shuttle Challenger, was not a sudden, unforeseen mechanical failure like Apollo 13. It was a known, documented hazard. Engineers at Morton Thiokol, the contractor responsible for the solid rocket boosters, vehemently argued against the morning launch, presenting data on the temperature dependency of the seals. Their warnings were not ignored by inexperienced managers. They were overridden by senior NASA officials deeply entrenched in the same cultural norms that had suppressed the Apollo 13 internal findings. The difference between the two incidents lies in the immediate aftermath. Apollo 13 had the luxury of a near miss. The crew survived to witness the cover-up. Challenger offered no such reprieve. The explosion was instantaneous, visceral, and public. The subsequent Rogers Commission investigation uncovered the same critical flaw that the internal Apollo 13 reviews had documented: the failure to respect engineering warnings when they conflicted with institutional momentum. The pressure to maintain the shuttle's flight cadence, the political desire to maintain the image of routine access to space, once again superseded the clear data regarding component integrity. Math Chapter 7. The Geometry of Denial. The internal Apollo 13 documentation detailed a specific type of management failure, the concept of normalization of deviance, a term later popularized in safety science. It describes the slow drift away from acceptable safety standards, where deviations that initially cause alarm eventually become accepted practice because they do not immediately result in catastrophe. In the case of oxygen tank number 2, the deviation was the repeated cycling of the heater switches without proper power conditioning, a deviation that went unpunished because the outcome was merely a successful launch and an arduous return. The geometry of denial established in 1970 created a template for how NASA processed bad news. A technical anomaly was framed as an isolated incident requiring heroic effort to correct, rather than a symptom of a systemic rot requiring structural overhaul. In the years between Apollo 13 and Challenger, the internal mechanisms designed to flag and halt dangerous practices were not fixed. They were merely bypassed more efficiently. The paperwork trail detailing the procedural waivers for the tank heaters, the evidence that managers knew the risk was intentionally obscured. This act of erasure was crucial because it allowed NASA to maintain the official story. The hardware failed due to unforeseen circumstances, not due to conscious managerial decisions to accept a higher probability of failure.